Hey guys, Grifster here. I'm coming out with this video today because I get a lot of comments from my gunners and other pilots of the AH-94 that they just can't keep this helicopter under control, and they have a lot of challenges flying it, whether that's speed, coming in for landings, or just keeping her in a nice straight level flight. Now, I'm going to go ahead and pop this camcorder on me right now to kind of explain some things. Now, a helicopter is obviously quite different than the jets you're probably used to from VTOL VR. Let me move this guy back a little bit. There we go. When we fly a jet, we're just using a turbine jet engine, right? And it throws exhaust out one direction out the back, and that helps propel us forward, right? But a helicopter, our propulsion is going downwards, right? So that brings in certain considerations. We're not using a turbine, we're using rotor blades. Now, a rotor blade can do a great job keeping us in the air, right? But there's special considerations to make sure it stays in the air, right? Obviously, one of the most important ones right here is we need to make sure that our rotator speed is adequate to get airborne. The next is we need to make sure we keep control of our torque, so we're not exerting too much force on our main shaft, otherwise it'll break. Now, these aren't things you really necessarily have to think about for the most part in VTOL VR. Your rotor blade will never come off. It should never separate from the aircraft unless you do something drastic or you get hit by a missile. But it's important to know this stuff, and here's why. So I'm going to switch back to my look view real quick. Oops, excuse me. Come back around. There we go. You should be able to see what I see now, right? So, as our rotor blades are spinning, and we're changing, and we're, keeping them moving, right? We have our good rotor, we have good torque. As we raise the collective, we'll get more torque, reacting force, right? Now, the reason we end up getting more torque is because we end up inevitably pushing more. Right now, you can see our blades are spinning, but we're not going anywhere, right? And that's because we haven't raised our collective. Now, a lot of people assume that the collective is directly proportional to power like you would have in a jet. It's almost like that, but it's not quite the same. The reason being that thrust is more a matter of RPM as well as nozzle control. This is what your typical thrust would look like in a jet, right? But for us in a helicopter, we don't get power the same way. Our power, instead of coming from high RPMs, comes from high RPMs mixed with the pitch of our blades. As we can see right now, our blades are flat, right? Let's see if we can get an outside look real quick, just to show you what I'm talking about. Now you can see that we're not moving anywhere in this view. And the reason for that is our pitch blade, or our blade pitch, is flat right now. In being flat, we're not pushing any air, we're just keeping our blades moving, we're keeping a good high rotor RPM, but we're not moving yet. So let's come back to me real quick. So what happens is, if I can just move this really quick, there we go, is our blades look like this. And when we add collective, our blades look like this. So what happens is we end up pushing air more efficiently, right? And we ideally push that air against the ground. Because the way it spins, it's going to push it in one direction. In VTOL VR, generally that means we have to compensate by putting yaw left to counter-rotate the energy coming from our blades. For most of you, this means you're flying constantly with foot on the left, on your left yaw pedal, or putting in a lot of yaw using your joystick. But there's an easier way to do this. So, here's my look, right? This is how I fly every single time. There's some important things on this HUD that we need to be aware of as pilots. The first one I want to point out is this square box right here in the middle. At the top, you'll see the two prongs in the ball. What those two prongs in the ball represent is whether or not our aircraft is in yaw trim. What yaw trim means is that our aircraft is going to be heading in a consistent direction and that we are countering the force that is being offset by our blades when they enter a new pitch. So what that does for us is it keeps us from having to use our left rudder pedal. Now, to adjust our yaw pitch, what we need to do is we go down to our collective here, and you're going to see we have an upper part of our collective, but also a lower part. The lower part has the yaw trim. Now, the yaw trim is adjusted by using your thumbstick on your accompanying controller. To see how you're affecting yaw trim, let's take a look at my second example. As you're going to see in my crosshair, there's a box there with an arrow and a line going through it. What that arrow represents is where your trim setting is in relation to your yaw. So if I were to move it to the left to compensate, it starts to do this. And as you'll see, we get a reaction from the aircraft almost immediately. we are now canted towards the left. So, in terms of compensation, we no longer have to do that when we take off. So that's how we compensate for yaw, is we just take control of our yaw trim hat switch or our joystick, and we just simply move it in compensation. Now, you don't have to leave it in this spot. Something I like to do is to play with my trim a little bit. This is where I'll set it for when I'm flying straight and level, but if I wanted to do something like shoot at a target while hiding behind a mountain, I might move my trim left or right to tilt my aircraft in one direction. This will be a lot easier to understand when we get airborne, but I want to talk about the other part of trim first. The second part of trim has to do with our joystick. As you can see, just like our collective, we have a joystick on our joystick which handles trim. The trim in this case is going to be this circular button. And what this circular button, the circular area represents, is where we are in relation trim for roll and pitch, right? As you can see, I move it left, the aircraft will start to roll left. If I move it to the right, the aircraft will move right to compensate. Now, same case for pitch. If I move it up, the aircraft pitches down. If I move it down, the aircraft will pitch up. This is a really great tool for if you want to keep your velocity vector on the horizon line or keep it above without having to necessarily mess with controls or keep your hand on the stick. But typically I just leave it where it is right now. As you can see, that yellow ball represents where our joystick is in relation to where we're moving it. So, when we first take off, we want to keep that ball as level as not necessarily as level as we can, but we want to keep it in one consistent place. And we really need to take into account where our aircraft is at the same time when setting it. Now, what you see in front of you is what I do every time before I take off my aircraft. This should be your average set of trim to make sure that you can get off the ground, fly comfortably in a straight direction. Let me demonstrate by lifting off the ground. Now, that obviously wasn't the smoothest landing, the smoothest takeoff, but you can see so far, I had to fight the aircraft a whole lot less to get the results I need. And if my trim is incorrect, as you can see, I can go back down to my collective and adjust it. It's all about keeping the ball in between the two prongs for yaw, and trim is really sort of a reactionary measure. So if you feel your aircraft is leaning and you have to compensate with your joystick, move your trim in that direction to compensate. Think of it like creating a reset point for us, right? Is what essentially we want to do is when we have an aircraft in trim, it will respond based on the inputs. So we're getting more predictable behavior out of it. So when you have a situation where you're falling out of control, generally it's because your aircraft will be out of trim, and you're having to compensate in ways to do that. When we have our trim set, it becomes much easier to maneuver, it becomes much easier to do changes, and you get a lot more predictable behavior out of the aircraft. The best way to tell that you're in trim is going to be looking at our HUD still. Now, I know we talked about the button, but we can do some other things as well. So, a good way to tell you're in trim is that your velocity vector, which is our circle up there with the dashes on it, should match our crosshair direction, right? Our velocity vector tells us where we're going with our aircraft, but our heading will not match that, right? So what we want to do is we want to get straight level trim flight is we want to make sure our velocity vector matches up with the direction of our aircraft. Now this is something that's going to take a lot of trial and error to get right. And it's some of those things that's going to take practice. But getting your aircraft in trim can make a world of difference. So much so that flying without it can really be a hazard to both yourself as well as your gunner. So do make sure you're taking the time to practice your trim. I recommend doing it in situations like this, in the training server, where it's much easier and there's less chance of being fired upon. But you might ask yourself, what if I'm perfectly fine flying outside of trim? If that works for you, that's fine. But you can do really clever tricks if you put your aircraft in trim, like so. Now, if my aircraft was not in trim, that barrel roll probably wouldn't have gone as well. Another important thing to consider as well when making maneuvers like that, especially in trim, is to keep an eye on your collective. The more collective you have, the more energy you are exerting. So if you want to go into a hover in trim, you simply just need to pull down on your collective, raise your stick up a little bit, and it'll be much easier to get into a hover. You can see we're getting a much cleaner hover than you would expect, even more so than the autopilot can provide in some cases. we're going to a much lower speed, and it's much easier to maintain our heading. So, this is my video on how to put your aircraft in trim. If this was helpful, please feel free to share it. If you have any further questions, feel free to leave me a comment, or contact me through my Discord page. But if you ever want to fly together, let me know. It's been great helping you guys out.